like you to go ahead and weigh in on the Bundy situation.
Yeah, so there's a whole host of things in related to the Bundys. That could have happened in Idaho just as easily as it did in Oregon. And I don't know all the detail to what transpired there, but I know enough to know that it was entirely mishandled by the federal government, and from the get-go, and it was mishandled by the local authorities, because somewhere along the way there was a local sheriff who didn't show up for work, and there was a governor who didn't show up for work, because either one of those entities could have had a stabilizing effect and solved this in a whole different fashion, and it should have been solved at the local level in the first place. Then after the whole thing, there's these retrials over and over and over again, which is just, it's an example of the heavy hand of government coming down so hard. And I've interacted with ranching families a fair amount. Waihee County is 86-87% federally owned land. And so if you're going to operate there, you don't have a choice but to be on some kind of federally owned land. And these ranchers in many cases have been there since before Idaho was a state. And so you've got to acknowledge that there's a right and a need over the course of time to access this property. But little by little, either via some federal channel or some lawsuit of some sort from an environmental group or whatever, these families are getting constrained and constrained and constrained. Their allocation for land access is being reduced. And in some cases, the water, which is necessary to have any use for the animals or for the ranching properties, is getting diverted to put more and more pressure. And so these families are feeling like they're under attack, and they are. Their way of life is going away, and it's being constrained for the wrong reasons by people who really don't have that authority. So, long-winded answer, and I apologize about that, but when your livelihood is threatened and you are paying your taxes, and you're paying that to the entity you believe that needs to go to, in the case of the Bundys, my understanding it was the county, and then the heavy hand of government comes crashing down, I can understand the emotion that comes with it. One thing that also I want to point out about this that doesn't seem to get brought up is one of the initial actions of the government, my understanding is that they were shooting some of these animals. And if you want to severely agitate a property owner, in this case a rancher, start shooting their animals. Mm-hmm. And you know what, I didn't really realize that until somewhat recently, but there's simply no excuse for that. So that's a roundabout answer on a long and difficult thing, but the bottom line is that we do have an obligation as elected officials to stand up for those within our constituency and stop the heavy hand of government and put some sanity into how these things are dealt with. The whole land issue, maybe this is a segue to another topic, but the whole land issue comes to play here. These lands shouldn't even be controlled by the federal government, as far as I'm concerned. The states in the West are predominantly federally owned. The states in the East are predominantly privately owned. I think I understand why that came about, but it's set in motion of a whole series of inequities and problems that we're dealing with because when the federal government has so much control over the land and over the economic resource, then that kind of makes the states that are in that situation a little bit more of a subsidiary than an autonomous sovereign state. And that's the case in Idaho. We can't tax 62% of the property because it's federally owned. And so the federal government tries to offset that with some kind of subsidy or payment in lieu of taxes. And those dollars all comes with strings attached. And so if we're going to receive those funds for schooling or whatever it might be, then we have to abide by somebody's rules that's said in Washington, D.C. And it's not right. It is true that we get more money back from the federal government than we put in through the tax base. But I would heavily argue that we would be much better off over the course of time if we could actively, wisely manage the resources under our feet and not take those subsidies. That way we control our own destiny. And by the way, Sherry, we have so much incredible wealth in this state. We have timber, we have minerals, we have natural gas, it's like what Ronald Reagan said about America. America is that great natural athlete. It's got all the tools, born with all the right tools. It's got the human resource, the natural resource. That's Idaho. In many cases, we're starving to death in a room full of food because we have so much in terms of our resource base, but we can't touch it. It actually gets worse because the federal government can't manage it. They're $21 trillion in debt. They don't have the resources to handle it. They're over their heads, so they don't. So every year, you and I and the rest of the taxpayers in the state of Idaho will pay somewhere around $70 million thereabouts, state tax money to fight fires that shouldn't be there in the first place. Those wildfires they take off and they run because of unmanaged federal land for the most part. There's fuel load that can't be harvested. It just adds to that fuel load for a lightning strike or a diseased forest. God gave us that resource and a mind to manage it and to do so wisely. And by not doing that, it takes a tremendous asset and it turns it into a tremendous liability. And there's also an environmental cost for that. If there's a lightning strike and we burn 500,000 acres, the amount of carbon that goes in the atmosphere and the amount of wildlife that gets devastated is just unbelievable. So the answer to this, and I'm sorry for rambling, but the answer to this is there has to be some wisdom put into how this resource is managed. There has to be some wisdom put into the utilization of a fabulous asset. Not selling it off, not closing access, opening access.
Do you believe the federal government should own the land, but we should manage it, or do you believe that the state should own the land and do what we need to do?
I think constitutionally, the way the first or the eastern states were brought into the Union was the appropriate way. As I understand it historically, the dividing line is approximately in that Civil War era. If states became a state prior to the Civil War, which is predominantly the eastern states, then the land transferred upon entry into the Union. The practice changed. The Constitution didn't change, but the practice changed post-Civil War, which is generally Colorado West. For those states, when they came into the Union, and my understanding is kind of two reasons behind that. One is there was a fear at the time by the general government, now called the federal government, that the South, the recently defeated South, may rise again in the West because a lot of the defeated Southerners had migrated west because the South had been decimated. The other reason, I understand, is because the general government wanted to use some of the resources, the mineral resources known to exist in the West, gold, silver, and maintain control of that for a period of time to pay off the Civil War debt. Well, guess what? The Civil War debt has been paid off for a long time, and those lands never transferred over. So I believe constitutionally, those should have transferred at the time of entry into the Union. It didn't happen. At a minimum, there should have been a transition over the course of time after that debt was paid. That didn't happen, and we're in the situation we're in. Ideally, I do believe that the states rightfully should be the owners of that. From a practical standpoint, should I be successful in being a member of Congress? I'm gonna take whatever advantages I can get, and that is, if I can help transition and put some wise local management into it, I'm gonna try to promote that. Because at a minimum, the management is the key, and that local influence needs to be adopted.
So you believe there should be steps taken to get the
Yes.
eventual goal, but don't stop what you're doing now on these steps, is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
So it's my understanding that Congressman Labrador actually has initiated a pilot program, which I think is good. And that would transition a certain amount of management of a certain amount of federal land to the local level and initiate that process. But if I could, there's
Yeah.
something else.
Whatever you want. Go
There's
ahead.
something else going on here that's really interesting that most people don't seem to realize. I mentioned earlier that for every dollar, or Idaho gets more money back from the federal government than we put into that bucket. And this is why, it's because of the lands. So for example, if when you and I pay our federal taxes, we put $1 in, we'll get about $1.35 back if you consider here are the grants that come with education or transportation or whatever. It's just the reverse in the East. So if you're in Connecticut or New Hampshire or Rhode Island, you put in $1 to the federal government in taxes, you get back maybe 65 cents. Well, not surprisingly, the eastern states are losing their sense of humor about subsidizing the western states. And if I were a member of Congress representing Connecticut, I would say, look, if we put $1 in, we want $1 back. Well, that's what they're doing. And I share that to say this. I believe the battle over western lands is going to be fought and won in the East. And that's the reason why, is because follow the money. In government, if you follow the money, you're going to get to the root of the issue. Eastern states know they're subsidizing the western states. They don't like that. And I believe this is going to be, the transition will happen. I can't tell you exactly when, but that's one of the major reasons why. And we're not ready. We need to be planning for this at the local level. We need to be having our stakeholders from all different outdoorsmen, ranchers, farmers, sportsmen. All those people need to be at the table to start planning for some of these things, and we're just not doing that yet.